What could possibly be more terrifying than facing a 60-ton behemoth of steel on the battlefield? It's the chilling realization that your own weapon, the trusted 75mm cannon on your M4 Sherman, might as well be throwing stones against its thick, sloped armor. For countless American soldiers in the heat-scorched landscapes of North Africa in 1943, this wasn't a hypothetical nightmare. It was a waking reality. They had come face to face with the Panzerkampfwagen V6, a name that struck far less fear than its simple, predatory moniker, the Tiger. This was more than just another enemy tank. The Tiger I represented a terrifying leap in armored warfare, a machine seemingly born from a different, more brutal future. Its reputation preceded it, whispered in hushed, anxious tones in the mess halls and foxholes. These whispers gave birth to a very real and pervasive condition known as tiger phobia. It's crucial to understand that this was not a symptom of cowardice. It was an entirely rational, psychological response to a weapon that seemed to defy the known rules of engagement. The Tiger's main gun, the legendary 88mm KK-36, was rumored to be able to destroy a Sherman tank from over a mile away, a distance at which the Sherman's own gun was hopelessly ineffective. Its frontal armor, at a solid 100mm, was virtually immune to the shells fired by the vast majority of Allied tanks at the time. Imagine yourself as a young corporal, barely out of your teens, peering through the narrow vision slit of your Sherman. Your world is a vibrating, oil-scented box of steel. Out in the shimmering heat haze, you see the unmistakable, boxy silhouette. It's a Tiger. It hasn't even turned its turret towards you, yet your heart hammers against your ribs. You've heard the stories. Your commander gives the order to fire, a futile gesture of defiance. The shell flies true, striking the German tank with a loud clang that echoes across the battlefield, only to ricochet harmlessly into the sky, like a pebble skipping off a boulder. And then, with a calm, deliberate slowness, the Tiger's massive turret begins to turn. In that moment, you understand that you are not in a battle, you are simply in the way. This was the essence of tiger phobia, a feeling of utter technological helplessness against an invincible foe. This psychological dominance was, perhaps, as powerful a weapon as the 88mm gun itself. It could paralyze units, shatter morale, and turn confident advances into hesitant, costly engagements. Allied commanders knew they had a monster on their hands. But a monster you cannot dissect is a monster you cannot defeat. They needed to understand it, to find a chink in its seemingly impenetrable armor, a flaw in its perfect design. But the Germans guarded their prized Tigers jealously. Wrecked Tigers were often booby-trapped or destroyed by their own crews to prevent their secrets from falling into enemy hands. For months, the Allies were fighting a ghost, a legend built on terrifying battlefield encounters and incomplete intelligence reports. Then, on a fateful day in April of 1943, near a hill designated as Jebel Jaffa in Tunisia, the fortunes of war delivered what can only be described as a miracle. A British Army unit, cautiously advancing, stumbled upon a sight so unlikely it was almost unbelievable. There it was, a Tiger tank, number 712, sitting silently in the sand. It wasn't burned out. It wasn't riddled with shell holes. In fact, it was almost completely intact. A lucky shot had reportedly jammed its turret, and in the chaos of battle, its crew had been forced to abandon it. They had left behind not just a tank, but the single most valuable intelligence prize of the entire North African campaign. For the Allied High Command, the capture of Tiger 712 was like being handed the enemy's playbook. It was an unexpected gift from the desert, a golden opportunity to finally look under the hood of the monster that had been terrorizing their forces. The tank was carefully secured, swarmed by intelligence officers and engineers who treated it with the reverence of archaeologists unearthing a pharaoh's tomb. Every bolt, every weld, every plate of steel held a potential secret. They believed the key to defeating the Tiger lay somewhere in its advanced optics, the complexity of its engine, or the metallurgical composition of its armor. They were partially right. The German engineering was, in many ways, a masterpiece of complex, over-engineered brilliance. But the greatest secret Tiger 712 held, the one that would ultimately become its Achilles heel, wasn't forged in steel or ground into a high-tech lens. It was a vulnerability far more fundamental, hidden in plain sight within the very heart of the beast. It was a fatal flaw connected to the one thing that gives any machine life: its insatiable, almost unbelievable thirst for fuel. The Allies were about to discover that the Tiger's greatest strength, its immense power and size, was inextricably linked to its most catastrophic weakness. The journey of Tiger 712 from the sands of Tunisia to a top-secret laboratory in America was about to begin. And what American engineers would uncover would not only demystify the monster, but would permanently change how they prepared to fight it. They were about to learn that the most effective way to kill a tiger wasn't always with a bigger gun, but by exploiting a simple, crippling dependency that would leave the fearsome predator stranded and helpless on the battlefield. The hunt was on, not for its armor, but for its appetite. How do you transport a 60-ton monster, the enemy's most prized technological secret, across an entire ocean during the height of a world war? This was the immediate, monumental challenge facing the Allies. The battle for Tiger 712 on the sands of Tunisia was over. But a new, silent battle was just beginning. This one would be fought, not with cannons and armor, but with cranes, cargo ships, and a constant, gnawing fear of the unseen enemy lurking beneath the waves. The Atlantic was infested with German U-boats, wolf packs that would have considered a ship carrying such a high-value target to be the ultimate prize. The loss of Tiger 712, before it could be studied, would be more than a logistical failure. It would be a catastrophic intelligence blunder. The operation was shrouded in the utmost secrecy. Tiger 712 was carefully loaded onto a transport ship. Its journey, a classified secret, known only to a handful of officers. It was a nerve-wracking voyage. Every creak of the ship's hull, every shadow on the sonar screen, a potential prelude to disaster. But fortune, it seemed, was still smiling on the Allies. The ship arrived safely in the United States, and the Tiger was carefully offloaded and placed on a reinforced rail car for the final leg of its journey. Its destination was a sprawling, secure facility in Maryland, a place that was, in essence, the Area 51 of military hardware for its time, the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Aberdeen wasn't just a military base, it was a sanctuary of science and engineering, a place where the weapons of war were systematically deconstructed, analyzed, and understood. It was a cathedral of reverse engineering, and Tiger 712 was its newest, most revered icon. Overseeing this critical project was a man uniquely suited for the task, Colonel George B. Jarrett, the director of the Foreign Materiel Branch. Jarrett was not your typical desk-bound officer. He was a man with a mechanic's soul in a colonel's uniform, possessing an insatiable curiosity for the machinery of war. He saw tanks not merely as weapons, but as complex industrial organisms, each with its own unique anatomy and physiology. For him, Tiger 712 was the ultimate specimen, and he was determined to lead the autopsy. But as Jarrett and his team prepared their tools, it's worth pausing to consider the perspective from the other side. One has to wonder what the German engineers at the Henschel factory were thinking. These were brilliant men, masters of their craft, who had undoubtedly poured thousands of hours into creating this marvel of steel. It's highly probable that they knew about the Tiger's prodigious fuel consumption. They would have seen the data from their own proving grounds. Perhaps they even raised red flags, warning military commanders that a tank this complex and thirsty would become a logistical nightmare. But in the feverish atmosphere of the Third Reich, where battlefield dominance and propaganda often trumped practicality, such concerns might have been dismissed. The strategic vision, possibly driven by Hitler himself, was for a weapon so powerful it could achieve swift, decisive victories. The long-term consequences of maintaining such a machine in a protracted war of attrition may have been a secondary, or even ignored, consideration. This internal conflict between sound engineering principles and political ambition may have sealed the Tiger's fate long before the first one ever rolled off the assembly line. Back at Aberdeen, any thoughts of grand strategy were put aside for the immediate, tactile experience of the machine itself. As the American engineers began their examination, their initial reaction was one of profound, and perhaps grudging, respect. This was not a crude instrument of war. It was a finely crafted, albeit brutally powerful, piece of machinery. They marveled at the Schachtelauf work, the complex system of interleaved and overlapping road wheels, which provided a stable ride and distributed the tank's immense weight. It was an engineering nightmare to maintain in the field, requiring the removal of multiple outer wheels to access a single inner one. But its design was undeniably sophisticated. They peered through the gunner's sight, a Zeiss optical instrument of such breathtaking clarity that it was leagues ahead of anything the Allies were mass-producing. This explained the Tiger's uncanny long-range accuracy. It could see you, target you, and kill you long before you could even get a clear view of it. Then there was the engine, a 23-liter Maybach 512, a powerhouse that purred with a deep, throaty rumble. It was the heart of the beast, designed to move its 60-ton frame across the battlefield with surprising agility. On paper, and in this sterile, controlled environment, the Tiger was a masterpiece. It was the physical embodiment of Germany's reputation for engineering excellence. Yet, this admiration was quickly tempered by a nagging, persistent question. The initial intelligence reports from the front lines were streaming in, and they painted a confusing picture. For every story of a Tiger single-handedly destroying a dozen Allied tanks, there was another, stranger report of one being found abandoned, seemingly undamaged, by the side of a road. Why would a crew abandon such a formidable and valuable weapon? The pieces didn't fit. A masterpiece of engineering shouldn't be failing in such high numbers due to mechanical breakdown. A weapon of such psychological power shouldn't be so readily discarded. The initial awe of the American engineers began to shift into a deep, analytical curiosity. The machine before them was perfect, yet its performance in the real world was flawed. This paradox was the real mystery of Tiger 712. The answer, Colonel Jarrett and his team began to suspect, was not to be found in the thickness of its armor or the power of its gun, but somewhere deeper, in the simple, relentless demands of its powerful engine. The admiration for German engineering was about to give way to a shocking discovery. Of all the sophisticated tests conducted at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the metallurgical analyses, the ballistic penetrations, the optical performance evaluations, the one that would ultimately seal the Tiger's fate was, ironically, the most mundane. It involved no explosions, no high-speed maneuvers, just a full tank of gasoline, a carefully measured course, and engineers with clipboards and stopwatches. They began what was arguably the most boring, yet most important, series of trials in the entire program, meticulously measuring the Tiger's fuel consumption. The numbers they recorded would not just be surprising, they would be strategically world-changing. The tests began under ideal conditions, driving on paved roads and hard, flat surfaces, simulating transit behind the lines. Even here, the results were sobering. The powerful Maybach engine, the heart of the beast, was astonishingly thirsty. It consumed fuel at a rate of approximately 1.2 miles per gallon. For a 60-ton war machine, this was terrible, but perhaps not entirely unexpected. It meant its massive 140-gallon fuel tanks would give it a maximum theoretical range of around 120 miles on a perfect road, a number that was already limiting for the kind of mobile warfare Germany had pioneered. But wars are not fought on perfect roads. The next phase of the testing was where the jaws of the American engineers truly began to drop. They moved Tiger 712 onto soft ground, muddy fields, and hilly terrain conditions that simulated an active European battlefield. They had the driver perform combat maneuvers, sharp turns, sudden accelerations, and pivoting the massive turret. The fuel consumption didn't just increase, it skyrocketed into a realm of logistical impossibility. The numbers were so extreme, they had to be checked and rechecked. In simulated combat conditions, the Tiger's fuel economy plummeted to an almost unbelievable 0.3 to zero point 0.4 miles per gallon. To put that into a modern American context is to understand the sheer absurdity of the figure. A gas-guzzling, heavy-duty American pickup truck might get 15 miles to the gallon on the highway. The German Tiger, in a fight, would be lucky to travel a little over 1,500 feet on that same gallon of fuel. This meant its practical combat, radius, the actual distance it could fight its way forward and return, wasn't the 60 or 70 miles one might assume. It was a catastrophic 20 to 30 miles. This wasn't just a limitation, it was a leash. A very, very short leash. This is the moment where the story pivots from a simple technical analysis to a profound clash of national philosophies. On one side, you had the American M4 Sherman. It was, by comparison, a model of efficiency. The Sherman wasn't a world beater in a one-on-one fight with a Tiger, but it was reliable, easy to repair with simple tools, and critically, it was logistically sustainable. Its engine allowed it to achieve around 1 to 1.5 miles per gallon, granting it a much more forgiving operational range. This meant a Sherman battalion required a fraction of the fuel and maintenance support that a Tiger battalion demanded. America wasn't trying to build the perfect dueling weapon. It was building an army. It was a system built for a long, grueling war of attrition, where sustainability was just as important as firepower. Germany, it now seemed clear, had built a thoroughbred racehorse, a magnificent, powerful creature designed for a short, glorious sprint. But World War II wasn't a sprint. It was a brutal, cross-continental marathon. America, on the other hand, had built mules, thousands upon thousands of them. They weren't as glamorous, but they were tough, they were dependable, and they could keep going, day after day, supplied by an endless logistical train. In a briefing room at Aberdeen, surrounded by charts and figures, the eureka moment arrived not with a shout, but with a dawning, silent comprehension. Colonel Jarrett and his team stared at the data. The numbers told an undeniable story. The Tiger's greatest weakness wasn't a vulnerable spot in its armor that a lucky shot could find. It was a systemic, unfixable flaw woven into its very DNA. The tank's immense weight required a powerful engine. That powerful engine demanded a complex transmission and drivetrain. And that entire power plant consumed fuel at a rate that the German war economy, already stretched to its breaking point, could never hope to sustain. Every single Tiger deployed to the field was, in essence, a ticking time bomb. Its fuse measured not in minutes, but in gallons. They finally understood the strange reports from the front lines. The abandoned Tigers weren't always the result of mechanical failure in the traditional sense. Their complex systems were simply giving out under the strain of being constantly pushed to their operational limits, often without enough fuel to even properly warm up or cool down. Crews were abandoning them because they had run out of the most basic element of mechanized warfare: gas. The monster, for all its strength, was chained to its supply lines, and the Allies now knew that if they couldn't break the chain, they could simply starve the beast at the end of it. The data was just numbers on paper, but it was about to become the most important weapon in the Allied arsenal. The engineers at Aberdeen hadn't just tested a tank. They had found the enemy's secret manual for self-destruction. How do you teach a young soldier, huddled in the cramped steel confines of his Sherman tank and gripped by a paralyzing fear of the Tiger, how to defeat a legend? You don't start by giving him a bigger shell. You start by giving him a smarter plan. You don't tell him to aim for the thickest armor, a near impossible task. You tell him to make the legend move. This was the revolutionary shift in thinking that began to ripple out from the quiet testing grounds of Aberdeen. The data was in, the numbers were irrefutable, and now the monumental task was to transform this dry, technical intelligence into a life-saving combat doctrine. The report from Colonel Jarrett's team landed on desks at the Pentagon with the force of a bombshell. It wasn't just a technical summary. It was a roadmap to the Tiger's self-destruction. The information was deemed so critical that it was fast-tracked, disseminated to the highest levels of the armored command, and, most importantly, to the training centers like Fort Knox, where thousands of young tankers were being prepared for the horrors of the European theater. The old training manuals, which focused on flanking shots and targeting supposed weak spots, were not thrown out, but they were about to get a crucial new chapter. This chapter wasn't about ballistics. It was about attrition. It was about weaponizing the enemy's gas gauge. The new doctrine that emerged was beautifully simple in its concept, yet profound in its implications. It was a strategy of asymmetric warfare, designed to leverage the Sherman's strengths, its agility, speed, and numerical superiority, against the Tiger's single greatest vulnerability. The core tenets were clear. First, avoid the duel. A head-on engagement with a Tiger was tactical suicide. Crews were now explicitly trained to refuse a direct, one-on-one fight unless absolutely necessary. The goal was no longer to prove your mettle, but to win the strategic engagement. Second, force movement. The new primary objective was to harass, to provoke, to make the Tiger traverse its heavy turret, to make it pivot its massive hull, to make it chase phantoms. A stationary Tiger was a near-impregnable fortress. A moving Tiger was a leaking fuel tank. American tank commanders were taught to use wolf pack tactics, sending multiple Shermans to probe from different directions, forcing the German crew to constantly react, burning precious fuel with every single maneuver. Third, control the terrain. Understanding the battlefield was now paramount. A Tiger stuck in a muddy field or forced to climb a steep hill would burn through its fuel reserves at an alarming rate. Allied commanders were encouraged to lure Tigers into unfavorable terrain, turning the landscape itself into a weapon. Finally, strike the supply lines. This was a broader strategic layer. The data from Aberdeen gave new urgency to the air campaign against German logistics. Every fuel truck, every railway car, every refinery that was destroyed by Allied bombers was now understood to be a direct blow against the operational capacity of Germany's heavy panzer divisions. This shift in doctrine had a powerful, almost immediate effect on the psychology of the American tanker. The knowledge of the Tiger's weakness was a potent antidote to the terror of Tiger phobia. Fear thrives in the unknown, in the face of an enemy that seems to have no weaknesses. By revealing the Tiger's crippling dependency on fuel, the army gave its soldiers something more valuable than a new type of ammunition. It gave them a sense of agency. They were no longer helpless victims waiting to be picked off. They were hunters who understood the prey's fatal flaw. Imagine the change in the briefing room before a mission. The fear is still there that never goes away. But it's no longer a shapeless dread. It's a focused, tactical challenge. The young corporal who once froze in terror now listens intently as his lieutenant points to a map. The plan isn't to charge the enemy. The plan is to feint from the left, draw the Tiger's attention, while another platoon makes a wide flanking run to the right, forcing it to reposition. The goal isn't necessarily to land a killing blow, but to force the Tiger to burn through another 10 gallons of its scarce fuel, to shorten its leash, to strand it far from its support. This newfound confidence was a form of armor all its own, a psychological shield forged from pure information. Of course, this transformation in thinking wasn't universally or instantly accepted. War is an institution steeped in tradition, and armor doctrine was traditionally about aggression, about closing with and destroying the enemy. There were undoubtedly some old guard, battle-hardened commanders who viewed these new tactics with skepticism. To them, it might have sounded passive, even cowardly. You want my boys to just annoy the enemy until they run out of gas? It flew in the face of the warrior ethos. This internal resistance, a debate between traditionalists and the new data-driven strategists, was a small but significant hurdle. It took time, and more importantly, battlefield results, to prove that this wasn't about avoiding a fight. It was about choosing a smarter way to win it. As the spring of 1944 arrived, this new doctrine was being drilled into the minds of every tank crew preparing for the invasion of Europe. In the fields of England, Vast armies were assembling for the largest amphibious assault in human history. The theory, born from the capture of a single tank in the African desert and confirmed in the quiet labs of Maryland, was now complete. The soldiers were trained. The strategy was set, but it had all been practice. The ultimate test was yet to come, in the bloody, close-quarters chaos of the Normandy hedgerows. Would this new tactic of logistical attrition actually work against the hardened veterans of Hitler's elite panzer divisions, fighting desperately on their home soil? The fate of the Western Front, and the lives of thousands of Allied tankers, could very well depend on the answer. June 1944. Across the English Channel, the largest amphibious force ever assembled tore a hole in Hitler's fortress Europe. But gaining a foothold on the beaches of Normandy was only the beginning. Beyond the sand and surf lay a landscape that would become a graveyard for tanks and men alike, the bocage. This was a claustrophobic maze of ancient sunken lanes, walled in by massive, earthen hedgerows thick with trees and roots. It was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare, a place where armored spearheads were blunted and battles were won and lost field by bloody field. It was into this meat grinder that Hitler finally unleashed his ultimate weapons, the elite heavy panzer battalions, with their fearsome tigers. And it was here, in these confined green tunnels, that the theories born in Aberdeen would face their trial by fire. A strange and unsettling sight began to greet the advancing American GIs. Pushing through a hedgerow, they would find themselves in a quiet field, and there, sitting silently under the dappled French sunlight, would be a Tiger tank. It would be angled for battle, its long 88mm gun pointing menacingly towards their line of advance. But there would be no sound, no puff of exhaust, no sign of life. Cautiously, they would approach, rifles raised, expecting an ambush. But the steel beast remained silent. Upon reaching it, they would find the hatches open, the interior empty. There were no scorch marks from an anti-tank rocket, no penetrating hole from a high-velocity shell. The tank was often in perfect working order, abandoned by its crew. The only evidence of violence was the deliberate damage of a scuttling charge, a final, spiteful act to deny the enemy their prize. What the GIs were witnessing was the brutal, real-world application of the doctrine born from Tiger 712. The German commanders had intended for their Tiger battalions to be a decisive counter-attacking force, a fire brigade that would rush to trouble spots and obliterate the Allied advance. But the reality of the Normandy campaign turned this strategy on its head. The constant, grinding pressure from Allied forces, combined with the restrictive terrain, meant the Tigers were always on the move. They weren't fighting grand, sweeping battles on open plains. They were engaged in 100 smaller, brutal skirmishes, constantly shifting positions, responding to threats, and maneuvering through the confusing labyrinth of the bocage. Every single one of these movements came at a staggering cost in fuel. While the Tigers were winning many of their individual tactical engagements, destroying Sherman after Sherman, they were decisively losing the strategic war of logistics. The ultimate predator of the Tiger in Normandy was not another tank. It was the American P-47 Thunderbolt, flying with impunity in the Allied-controlled skies. These fighter bombers, nicknamed Jabos by the Germans, relentlessly prowled the French roads. Their primary targets were not the heavily armored Tigers themselves, which were incredibly difficult to destroy from the air, but the soft-skinned fuel trucks and supply columns that were their lifeline. A burning fuel tanker on a road miles behind the front lines was as effective at killing a Tiger as a perfectly placed armor-piercing round. Now, place yourself in the turret of one of these Tigers. You are a veteran commander, confident in your machine and your crew. You've just destroyed 2 Shermans that foolishly tried to challenge you head-on, but you have no time to savor the victory. The radio crackles with a new order, an American breakthrough 3 miles to the west. You must move to contain it. You order your driver to start the engine, and you feel the familiar, powerful rumble of the Maybach. But you also glance at the fuel gauge. The needle is worryingly low. The promised refuel was supposed to arrive this morning, but the supply column was ambushed by Jabos. You have a choice. stay put, and create a powerful defensive position, or obey the order and risk running dry in the middle of nowhere. You choose to move. The 3-mile journey is a nightmare. You crawl along a narrow sunken road, the engine working hard to pull the 60-ton behemoth through the mud. A group of Shermans appears, firing from a wooded ridge. They don't press the attack. They just force you to stop, traverse the turret, fire a few rounds, and then they melt back into the trees. It's a game of cat and mouse, but you are the one with a hole in your pocket. Finally, your engine sputters. It coughs and then dies. The silence that follows is more terrifying than the sound of battle. You are now a stationary steel pillbox, a magnet for every Allied artillery piece and fighter bomber in the sector. The radio crackles again, but you have no power. You are alone. Your crew looks at you. Their face is a mixture of frustration and fear. You have the best tank in the world, a weapon that cost a fortune to build, but without fuel, it is nothing more than a tomb. With a heavy heart, you give the order to abandon ship and place the demolition charges. You are not defeated by the enemy's firepower, but by the simple, humiliating logic of an empty tank. This scene played out again and again across the battlefields of Normandy. The strategy of weaponizing the Tiger's fuel gauge was working beyond the wildest dreams of the Aberdeen engineers. The panzer divisions were being bled white, not just of men and machines, but of the very fuel that powered their advance. Normandy was a resounding, brutal confirmation that an invincible weapon with an unsustainable supply chain is, in the long run, a useless weapon. The legend of the Tiger was being dismantled, not by a bigger gun, but by a smarter strategy. Yet, the war was far from over. Hitler, reeling from the disaster in France, was preparing one last, desperate offensive. It would be a massive gamble, a final throw of the dice that would pit the last reserves of his panzer forces against the Allies in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a battle that would be decided, once and for all, by the logic of logistics. In the bitter cold of December 1944, with the Third Reich crumbling on all fronts, Hitler did the unthinkable. He gathered the last of his strategic reserves, the remnants of his once invincible panzer divisions, and hurled them into one final, monumental gamble through the dense, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes in Belgium. The offensive, known to the Americans as the Battle of the Bulge, was a shocking success in its opening days, catching the Allied forces completely by surprise. But this was not a conventional military operation with conventional goals. The primary objective for the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Paper and the other elite SS Panzer units wasn't the city of Antwerp or the splitting of Allied armies. Not really. Their most immediate, most critical target was something far more mundane: the massive Allied fuel dumps stockpiled behind the American lines. The entire German offensive, Hitler's last hope, was designed to run on stolen fuel. This was the ultimate, desperate admission of the very weakness the Allies had discovered in Tiger 712. The German war machine was running on fumes, and the Ardennes offensive was conceived as the largest armed robbery in history. German tankers started the attack with just enough fuel in their tanks to get them to the Meuse River, with the explicit understanding that if they failed to capture American gasoline along the way, the entire offensive would literally grind to a halt. Every German commander, from the field marshals down to the tank sergeants, knew that their greatest enemy in the Ardennes wasn't the American soldier or his Sherman tank. It was their own fuel gauge. The lessons of Normandy had not been learned by the German High Command. They had simply been ignored in a final act of strategic delusion. As the German tanks, including the new and even more formidable King Tiger, smashed through the thin American lines, a palpable sense of panic gripped the Allied command. But as the advance pushed deeper into Belgium, the German timetable started to slip. Stiff resistance in key towns, like Streetvith and Bastogne, slowed them down, forcing them into costly detours and engagements. And with every hour that passed, with every mile they drove, their engines were drinking the last of their precious fuel. The story of U.S. Army Major Hal D. Macaulay provides a stark, ground-level testament to the German predicament. During the chaotic fighting, Macaulay witnessed a scene that was both pathetic and profoundly revealing. He saw German soldiers, the supposed supermen of the master race, desperately clustered around a knocked-out American tank. They weren't salvaging weapons or ammunition. With rubber hoses, they were frantically siphoning the last dregs of gasoline from its tanks into jerry cans. This wasn't a strategic operation. It was the behavior of men running on empty, their magnificent war machine brought low by the simple lack of fuel. It was a scene of utter desperation, the logistical nightmare of the German command, made real in the actions of its freezing, exhausted soldiers. All across the Ardennes, the same tragic story was unfolding. The mighty King Tigers, 70-ton behemoths that were virtually immune to any Allied tank gun from the front, were proving to be even thirstier than their predecessors. One after another, these apex predators of the battlefield were being found abandoned along the frozen roads and in snow-filled ditches. Crews, many of them fanatical veterans, were forced to destroy their pristine, undamaged machines and retreat on foot, all because their fuel tanks had run dry. The spearhead of the attack, which had advanced so daringly, simply withered and died, not from a crushing military defeat, but from logistical starvation. The American defenders who held the line at crucial crossroads did more than just stop an army. They ran out the clock on Germany's fuel supply. The Battle of the Bulge was the final, thunderous echo of the truth uncovered at Aberdeen. It was the definitive, bloody proof that Germany's entire philosophy of warfare, built on the concept of the technologically superior Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon, was a catastrophic failure when pitted against the realities of a sustained, industrial-scale conflict. Hitler's belief that a handful of invincible Tigers could overcome thousands of sustainable Shermans was a fantasy. He had conceived of a war of lightning strikes, of brilliant tactical victories achieved by godlike machines. But World War II was not a Wagnerian opera. It was a brutal, grinding war of attrition. It was a war of factories, of oil fields, and of supply lines. And in that war, the side that could keep its machines moving would inevitably triumph. The German advance in the Ardennes faltered and then collapsed, leaving a trail of abandoned, silent steel monuments to a failed strategy. As the smoke cleared over the Ardennes and the last German resistance crumbled, the war in Europe entered its final chapter. The lessons that Tiger 712 had begun to teach in the laboratories of Maryland were now undeniable laws, written in the blood and snow of the Belgian winter. The war had been won not just by courage on the battlefield, but by the relentless, grinding power of logistics. And as for the tank that started it all, its journey was far from over. Tiger 712 was not destined for the scrapyard or to become a forgotten relic. It was about to embark on a new, and perhaps even more important, career. It was set to become a teacher, ensuring that the costly lessons it had provided would be passed down, shaping the minds of future generations of American soldiers and the very design of the tanks they would one day command. For decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, in the humid pine forests of Georgia at the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, a new generation of American tankers would gather in classrooms. They were young men, born after the war, training to command machines their fathers could only have dreamed of. And as part of their curriculum, they would learn about one of the greatest enemy tanks in history. But the lesson was not one of admiration. It was a cautionary tale. They learned about a fearsome predator, a legend of the battlefield, not to understand how to build one like it, but to understand precisely why they should not. The ghost of Tiger 712, the machine that had been so meticulously dissected at Aberdeen, had found its final calling. It had become a professor of warfare, and its subject was the anatomy of failure. The second life of Tiger 712 wasn't as a physical museum piece, sitting in an American warehouse. Its parts were scattered, its data absorbed into countless classified reports. Its true legacy was as a powerful and enduring idea. It became the ultimate case study, a what not to do that was drilled into the minds of American armor officers and tank designers. The core lesson was simple, yet it was a concept that the German High Command had catastrophically failed to grasp. Tactical brilliance is meaningless without strategic sustainability. A weapon that cannot be reliably fielded, fueled, and fixed is, for all its firepower, a liability. The instructors at Fort Benning, many of them veterans who had faced tigers in the hedgerows of Normandy or the forests of the Ardennes, would pass this lesson down like a sacred inheritance. They explained that the tiger's failure wasn't just about its shocking fuel consumption. It was a systemic collapse on every logistical level. Its complexity made it a nightmare to mass produce. Germany built fewer than 1,400 Tigers in total, while America churned out nearly 50,000 Shermans. Its 60-ton weight was too much for many European bridges, severely limiting its strategic mobility, and its maintenance requirements were astronomical. The famous interleaved road wheels, while providing a smooth ride, could take a maintenance crew a full day to repair in the mud and cold if an inner wheel was damaged. A Sherman, by contrast, could often be patched up and sent back into the fight within hours. This philosophy, this generational lesson, became the bedrock of American tank design for the next half-century. It was a direct lineage of thought, connecting the very real battlefield experiences of one generation to the engineering blueprints of the next. When designers sat down to create the next main battle tanks, the specter of the abandoned Tigers loomed large in their minds. The M48 pattern, which would become a workhorse during the Cold War and in Vietnam, was a direct reflection of this doctrine. It was tough, it was reliable, and it was designed with maintenance and operational range as key priorities. It was a balanced machine, a tool for a sustainable army, not a fragile masterpiece for a short, glorious battle. And then came the M1 Abrams, the undisputed king of the modern battlefield. And here, the legacy of the Tiger presents a fascinating and seemingly contradictory twist. The Abrams is powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine, an engineering marvel that gives it incredible speed and acceleration. But that engine is also notoriously thirsty, consuming fuel at a rate that makes even the Tiger's Maybach engine seem almost economical by comparison. On the surface, it looks as if the American designers had forgotten the most important lesson their predecessors had learned. But they hadn't forgotten the lesson. They had mastered it. The key difference between the Tiger and the Abrams is not the engine's thirst, but the entire universe of logistical support built to quench that thirst. The lesson from the Tiger was never simply, don't build a fuel-hungry tank. It was far more sophisticated. If you are going to field a powerful, high-maintenance weapon, you must first be willing and able to build an unrivaled global logistics system to support it. Germany built the Tiger in a vacuum, a tactical marvel with no realistic strategic support system. The United States built the Abrams as the centerpiece of a massive, globally integrated logistical network. For every M1 Abrams on the front line, there is a vast and complex tale of C-17 transport planes, mobile refueling vehicles like the M978 HEM, and a doctrine of forward positioning fuel and parts that is unparalleled in military history. The U.S. military accepted the Abrams' high consumption rate as a necessary trade-off for its superior performance, and then solved that problem with the full might of its industrial and logistical power. The Tiger was a brilliant weapon attached to a broken system. The Abrams is a brilliant weapon that is merely one component of a brilliant and astonishingly well-funded system. This is the final, profound legacy of Tiger 712. It taught America that true technological superiority in warfare is not just about having the single best piece of equipment. It is about creating the most resilient and effective system, a system that includes everything from the factory floor to the forward operating base. The story of the Tiger is a timeless parable about the dangers of hubris, about becoming so enamored with the perfection of the weapon that you forget the simple, brutal realities of the war it must fight. It's a reminder that the most complex machine in the world can be defeated by the simplest of problems. As we look at the landscape of modern warfare, this lesson is more relevant than ever. The story of Tiger 712, which began with a lucky shot in the Tunisian desert, is therefore not just a chapter from a long-finished war. It is an enduring principle, a fundamental truth about the relationship between power, technology, and practicality. A truth that proves, time and time again, that the mightiest sword is useless if its wielder is too exhausted to lift it. In the grand saga of the Second World War, a conflict defined by titanic clashes of armies and ideologies, the story of Tiger 712 occupies a unique space. It reminds us that history often pivots not on the loudest explosions, but on the quietest discoveries. The fate of nations can be altered not just by the courage of soldiers, but by the careful calculations of engineers in a laboratory thousands of miles from the fight. The Tiger I stands as a testament to German engineering genius, a machine that, in a one-on-one duel, was nearly unmatched. But war is never a simple duel. It is a brutal, relentless equation of logistics, and the Tiger was a masterpiece of tactics that failed the simple math of sustainability. A weapon, no matter how technologically advanced or intimidating, becomes utterly useless the moment it sits motionless on a battlefield, waiting for a drop of fuel that will never arrive. The image of those abandoned steel behemoths, stranded in the mud of Normandy or the snow of the Ardennes, serves as a powerful and timeless symbol. They are monuments to a fatal flaw in strategic thinking, a belief that superior quality could single-handedly overcome overwhelming quantity and unbreakable supply lines. The Tiger was, in the end, a brilliant tactical predator with a catastrophic genetic defect, an appetite it could never satisfy in a world where its food source was constantly under attack. But this brings us to a fascinating and crucial debate, one that historians and enthusiasts continue to argue over to this day. Was the Tiger I truly a failed design? Or was it simply a highly specialized weapon, a breakthrough sniper rifle in a world that required a reliable infantry carbine that was tragically misused in a war Germany was no longer equipped to fight? If Germany had possessed unlimited access to fuel and resources, if their supply lines had been secure, would the story have been different? Would the battlefields of Normandy and the Ardennes have seen the Tiger battalions sweep aside the Allied advance and perhaps change the course of the war? This is where the story moves beyond simple facts and figures and into the realm of speculation and opinion. There is no easy answer. One could argue that a weapon that requires such perfect conditions to operate effectively is, by its very nature, a flawed weapon for the chaotic reality of total war. Others might contend that the fault lay not with the tank's designers, but with the strategic blindness of a leadership that demanded a weapon it could no longer afford to maintain, deploying it in roles for which it was never intended. And now, I want to turn that question over to you. Based on the story you've just heard, what is your verdict on the Tiger tank? Was it an overrated logistical nightmare that was doomed from the start? Or was it a masterpiece of engineering that was simply a victim of a larger strategic failure? Share your own analysis and opinions in the comments section below. I read every one, and I'm genuinely curious to see where you stand on this enduring debate. The story of Tiger 712 and its fatal thirst for fuel is a powerful reminder that some of the greatest battles of World War II were not decided by the thunder of cannons alone, but by the silent, relentless war of logistics. Countless other Achilles' heels like this one helped shape the outcome of the conflict. Hidden in the metallurgical reports of U-boat steel, the quality of rubber in transport truck tires, or the production rates of aircraft engines. If you want to uncover more of these hidden stories, where intelligence and analysis triumphed over brute force, and where the course of history was changed by a single, critical discovery, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us for our next investigation. Because in war, as in life, sometimes a full tank of gas is more important than the heaviest armor. Thank you for watching.